Remember that old guy who used to be president? The one run by a gang of war hawks in fancy suits who told us that Putin and Russia are on the verge of collapse, that the killing of tens of thousands of women and children in Gaza was being done in a humanitarian way and would end up destroying Hamas, who insisted that inflation was being brought under control, and who became such a threat to the Democratic Party that they removed him from the presidential campaign in a soft coup. Yeah, that guy, Joe Biden. Remember him? Well, events in the last days show that we're now in what could be called the post-Biden era. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization, and this is your daily update for February 17th, 2025. Now, it's not just the end of the post-Biden era, or the beginning of the post-Biden era. It's the end of a 500 to 600 year era of European colonialism. I'm going to give you 5 indications from the last days that show how we are turning the page and moving into a new era, one which could result in a new security and development architecture and a break with the period of wars and austerity under the direction of global corporate cartels and their banker allies. So let's start with the Gabbard confirmation. Tulsi Gabbard was confirmed last week as Director of National Intelligence. This combined with the exposure coming out on USAID, which is a regime change coup operation, this offers the opportunity to clean out the rot of the deep state that's embedded in the intelligence community. Gabbard is clear that she intends to do that. Trump has given her the go-ahead to do it. There was an attempt to stop her nomination, and it didn't work. So there's an opportunity now to take this on. And as you know, there have been exposures of USAID running operations all over the world, and from African countries to places like Hungary and Belarus and Slovakia. So that was the first step. Now, secondly, there was the Trump-Putin phone call. And everyone had been waiting to see, will Trump and Putin get together? Well, the reports are that they had a 90-minute phone call. Both sides were happy with the outcome. They talked about ending the war in Ukraine, but not just the war in Ukraine. They talked about collaboration in a number of other areas, including the economy, including energy, and the prospect for a summit coming up in the very near future, and extending at some point the cooperation to bring in Xi Jinping of China. So this is a big break. Remember, Biden had not spoken with Putin since December 2022. Now, the third event was the Defense Secretary Hegseth speaking at NATO. This was the Ukraine Defense Cooperation Group or Contact Group. And he made a very clear point. The war must end. That was evident that would be one of the central topics of his involvement there. But it was also that the U.S. is not going to be participating anymore in continuing the war. He said there were several conditions for ending the war. One, no membership in NATO for Ukraine. He said that was not realistic for Ukraine to seek membership. Secondly, Ukraine will not get the territory back, the territory they've lost in the war with Russia. And third, if there are deployment of peacekeepers, they will not be NATO. Because if they are NATO and they end up fighting with Russia, it's a Russia versus NATO war. Now, these were extremely calmly, or they presented these calmly, but they're extremely provocative statements. And the NATO officials were clearly unhinged and destabilized by hearing this from the U.S. Secretary of Defense after a long period in which they had had the complete agreement for the war in Europe from Lloyd Austin, who was Biden's Secretary of Defense. Now then, fourth was the speech by Vice President J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference. Extremely strong criticism of Europe. Hegseth LaRouche described this as a breath of fresh air. He covered the crisis of mass migration, how this is affecting Europe, the censorship of free speech, violating the traditions of real Western democracy, the overturning of elections in the name of defending democracy. And he referred specifically to Romania and the threat from the former European Commissioner Thierry Breton to give Germany the same treatment as Romania if the wrong people get elected in the German election next Sunday. He also was very critical of the exclusion of speakers from the so-called left and the so-called right, basically saying that in a democracy you cannot be afraid of hearing opinions that differ from your own. And finally, he said, and this is very significant, it's not Russia and China that are threatening Europe, but the European Union institutions and national governments that are running away from the traditional policies of European countries. Now, Politico described this as the speech as a wrecking ball. And the Foreign Policy magazine said European delegates were gobsmacked by what Vance had to say. Again, this is a reversal of the unity between the US and Europe under the City of London and Wall Street corporate cartels that were committed to using the Ukraine war as a sledgehammer against Russia. So it appears as though this has now ended. Now, finally, there was the Rubio-Lavrov conversation. The U.S. Secretary of State talking with the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs. And they talked about maintaining an open channel of communication, which had been shut down during the period of the collective Biden. They also said the goal is, quote, to remove unilateral barriers inherited from the previous U.S. administration that have hindered mutually beneficial trade, economic, and investment cooperation. So they explicitly identified the Biden administration as responsible for breaking those ties and affirmed the importance of maintaining and developing those ties for the future. Now, building on this change was a fantastic discussion at the International Peace Coalition Zoom call last Friday between former South African Foreign Minister Naledi Pandor and the Schiller Institute's Hegseth LaRouche, where they discussed in particular how to achieve peace in the Middle East. And Dr. Pandor brought in her experience from the post-apartheid South Africa as to what kind of approach must be taken to bring peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And what she said in particular is that the Schiller Institute should assume a leadership role to develop a positive, constructive agenda for peace. And that's in fact what the Schiller Institute has been doing through the International Peace Coalition every Friday with their Zoom calls. I have in the description section of today's update links to both a report from last Friday's call as well as the video itself. It's over 2 hours, but you'll see the incredible dialogue plus participation of others such as the former president of Guyana and other individuals. Now, what I've just laid out should be compelling evidence that you don't have to suffer in silence as a spectator. The world is changing in a good direction, and it could be a much better direction if we keep mobilizing. So it's up to us to do that. And the Schiller Institute, the LaRouche organization, have been waging this fight for many, many years. In the next days, we'll have more reports on what we're doing to get the Oasis Plan to be the basis for peace between Israel and Palestine, and also the importance of the exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche if we're serious about rooting out corruption in the intelligence community and the Justice Department. So thanks for joining me today. Stay active, keep your mind going, and I'll see you tomorrow.